Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. A warm welcome to everyone from the Online Academy of the Global Labor University to this webinar on labor and the energy crisis. We are very honored to have with us today two distinguished professors as speakers, and Professor Markus Wissen from the Berlin School of Economics and Law as a moderator. Before I hand over to Markus to introduce the speakers and start the discussion, an invitation to everyone to please send us your comments and questions in the chat box. Thank you again for joining us, and over to you, Markus.
Yeah, many thanks, Elira, and welcome also from my side. My name is Markus Wissen. I work at the Berlin School of Economics and Law and also for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin. And I'm involved in the Online Academy of the Global Labor University. Today's subject is topical in several respects. There is an urgent need to phase out fossil fuels in order to cope with climate change. And this undertaking is, however, confronted with a lot of challenges and a lot of difficulties. The dependency of many societies on fossil fuel infrastructures, the power of fossil capital, and not least also the dependence of many workers on a job in fossil fuel industries and in the mining sector. The jobs versus environment dilemma. And with the Russian war against Ukraine, the difficulties have even increased. There is a partial renaissance of coal as an energy source, and the extraction of gas through fracking has been intensified, threatening and destroying the livelihoods of many people in the global south, but also in the global north. We cannot address all these topics in a 1-hour webinar, but at least some of them will be discussed today, both analytically and with regard to the progressive political strategies. I'm very happy to welcome, and Elira already has introduced them, I'm very happy to welcome two renowned scholars who have been working on these and related issues for quite a long time and who are going to introduce into today's discussion through inputs of approximately 10 minutes each. And they will present their talks that also will be available in the course Just and Green of the Global Labor University Online Academy. These talks will be launched tomorrow, so you are also invited to have a look at the course Just and Green of the Online Academy. Dimitris Stevis is a political scientist at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, working on the labor-environment relationship, just transition, and among many publications, I would like to stress the Handbook of Environmental Labor Studies, a very valuable compendium of this new discipline, environmental labor studies, that he co-edited together with Nora Rätzel and David Asel last year. Patrick Bond is a political economist and ecologist at the University of Johannesburg. He is well known for his books and articles on environmental issues, imperialism, social movements, and developments in South Africa. Today, he is going to take a critical look on the role of South African unions in general in the energy sector and in energy transition. So everybody has 10 minutes to present shortly some insights of his talk on this subject. And yeah, I would like to ask Patrick to start.
It's fantastic to be with everyone. The Global Labor University has been one of the most inspiring networks, and the fact that you've kept going and visited us in Johannesburg, where I got a chance to participate, makes me very proud to be in your circuits. Rather than do PowerPoints, I can send them to you if anyone would like. I'll really go through lines of argument that have become very controversial in South Africa, especially here in Johannesburg in the last 3 or 4 months. And it's partly because, as I've tried to address in my short video, our strongest union, the largest union, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, has done an extraordinary U-turn. It was probably, without exaggeration, one of the world's leading eco-socialist forces demanding a just transition and fully aware that the climate catastrophe was going to hit the proletariat and the peasantry the hardest, especially in Africa. And we've had so many important reminders of that here in South Africa, including in Durban, just in April, in one day when 350 millimeters of rain fell, a rain bomb, killing 500 people. And NUMSA made a statement, but frankly, the dilemma of the geopolitics, what Markus said was very accurate, that we've got confusion as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which the metal workers actually support, and they've even in their most recent conference document told President Cyril Ramaphosa he must do more within the BRICS to support Vladimir Putin. Now, this is a line of argument. Some call it campist. It's not that common. It's certainly in the leadership of this union very important. And I think it also relates to what I want to now quickly go through, about 4 arguments in about 1 minute each. What is NUMSA saying about energy? It is the union that controls the ESCOM, the state-owned parastatals, coal-fired power plants, and has a great deal of carbon-intensive employment in smelters of minerals, in the high carbon production factories, including automobiles, and therefore will be very hard hit by the decarbonization. So let's quickly ask, what are they saying in their brand new document, the National Congress Secretariat Report for 15 to 19 June. So it's a current document of this year. Quote, we've been calling for broad-based industrialization, especially beneficiation of our minerals. This cannot be undertaken with renewables. It requires a strong energy baseload. Now, this is a very important argument. So let's quickly ask, if this were the case, let's say, why is Germany sometimes able to run 100% of its industry on renewables when there are days of strong sunshine and hard-blowing wind? But more particularly, what do you need for baseload to make sure that if you do have a renewables sector, you have enough energy storage? And the answer is often you need more lithium or lead batteries. But I think what the innovations here have been would be to ask for less invasive forms of energy storage that can provide baseload. Now, molten salt, so you melt the salt next to a concentrated solar power generator. And then in the evening, for about 9 hours, the turbines can still run as that salt cools. The second way is energy storage, pumped storage, with small hydro systems. And we actually have quite advanced versions of that in South Africa. So I would reject that first one, but I think it's important to grapple with. A second argument, quote, there's pressure being exerted from several corners for decommissioning of the coal-fired power stations, but little thought is given to the disruption of the livelihoods of the workers, nor is there due consideration given to communities that will be affected. And I think NUMSA is absolutely correct. Our team, progressives, the red-green forces, we've not done a very good job with the just transition in making concrete demands. Now, South Africa is fortunate that we do have a group, Alternative Information and Development Center, AIDC, which has put together the Million Climate Jobs Alternative. So it's not impossible to, let's say, go out and argue that as you close down the coal-fired power plants, as you close down some of the smelters, perhaps, that really shouldn't be running. I don't think there's any question that there's enormous waste. We also have a massive refinery called Sasol at a place, Secunda, that's the #1 point source of emissions because they squeeze coal to get liquid petroleum. In other words, there's lots of inefficiencies. And unfortunately, NUMSA has workers that would be affected. So we definitely need to find alternative strategies. I'm with NUMSA on that one. There's a second part of this, which is if you need to do this decarbonization, you can use a stick or a carrot. Let me quickly address both because NUMSA is very concerned. First, they say there's a scarecrow. If we don't move away from coal-fired power, our exports will not be bought because they would have been produced by technologies that contribute to climate change, end quote. Again, it's a quote from this brand new document in June. Unfortunately, their Congress was disrupted, so they didn't really have any serious debates. I don't think it's a scarecrow. I think the carbon border adjustment mechanism, climate sanctions on the product of labor, if that product includes energy embedded in the export that is high carbon, that will become a major problem. And not just for carbon, even though the EU has kind of gone a little mad by calling methane gas green and nuclear green, Okay, hopefully that's temporary. There is definitely a move in the West, and you could call it imperialist. I won't dispute it. You can call it protectionist, yes. But it is a logic in which if you are cheating, in other words, there's leakage in your own Western policies for climate to have renewable energy, but then you have cheaper imports from coal-fired power plants that go into South African exports of aluminium, of iron and steel, of automobiles, then there will be sanctions. And I don't think we can get away from that. And in some ways, there may be some merit. There's also a carrot. Very quickly, quote from NUMSA, Ramaphosa, the president, signed a deal with imperialist powers, the US, UK, France, Germany, the EU. He was promised $8.5 billion to help move away from coal to cleaner forms of energy. Almost half of that money is going to land in the hands of the president's brother-in-law, who's a major solar investor. It is not far-fetched to see that the president stands to personally gain in the long term from this deal. The energy sector is in the process of rapid capture by oligarchs, and the bourgeois media is celebrating this sophisticated form of state capture. And I think I'll just end with, well, let me very quickly address that. NUMS is correct that there's a danger that as we decarbonize, it will be privatized renewables. And that adds to the cost and also to the possibility that states in the US like California and Texas have witnessed, in which you get speculation and all sorts of disruptive effects. And then, however, I mean, there is 8.5 billion. It will be a model for the rest of the world. We do have to grapple with it. In my view, it's a climate debt down payment. And in that sense, we should support that the West does help decarbonize and pay for us to leave fossil fuels underground. But we do have to watch very carefully because the ESCOM leadership wants to have about 44% of that money in the form of gas, methane gas. And we expect that to come from Mozambique, where there's a war. So we call it blood methane. A very final point, and I'll close. NUMSA makes this argument. While the government has committed itself to move away from coal, we notice that coal exports have skyrocketed. Many countries in the world, especially those in the BRICS axis, refuse to make such commitments. China continues to build coal-fired power stations with clean coal technologies. The fundamental question is, why are we not doing the same given the abundance of coal? End quote. Now, what I've tried to do with all of these is to basically say, these are arguments. I don't think we have any clean coal operating. It's a bit of a technological myth, but also to use the argument that we should continue because China just isn't convincing when we're facing this existential threat. So I've kind of concluded here by taking what I think are the 5 strongest arguments, even though some are quite weak, and trying to figure out how we grapple with this former union that was at the cutting edge of the analysis and actual practice for a just transition and decarbonization. And it has made a U-turn. And I'd like to end by saying, I think part of this is going to be honestly discussing how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has switched around a lot of people's ideologies, including in the global labor movement. So we do have in this country, in the Communist Party and in some of the left formations, some sympathy for anything that's against the West. It's a sort of, my enemy's enemy is my friend. But with the coal price having skyrocketed, it was $50 a ton in mid-2020 at the low point. And now it's $440 a ton today. And our currency's also gone down. So it's very attractive for trade unions that have coal miners or coal-fired power plants where we have this big coal inheritance from apartheid. It is very attractive for them to make a U-turn, as I've argued NUMSA has done. We have to make some extremely good arguments and persuade the rank and file, the shop stewards, and maybe some of these leaders that this is a terrible mistake. But I thought it useful to grapple with some of the ways in which here in South Africa, these arguments are unfolding. Maybe they're similar to arguments you're seeing in your part of the world. Thanks, comrades. Amanda, away too, as we say.
Yeah, many thanks, Patrick. I think that is a very concrete case, but nevertheless a paradigmatic case too. Yeah, so I think we can learn a lot from looking at South Africa about these specific dilemmas and how to get out of them. Yeah, I think this question, how to get out of them, is something that Dimitris is going to discuss in his presentation. You are going to talk about different pathways and pathways. There is a noise in the okay. So Dimitris is going to discuss different pathways out of this dilemma and assess these pathways from the perspective of a progressive trade union strategy. Dimitris, the floor is open for your presentation.
Well, thank you, Markus, and thanks to the Global Labor University, Lira and Adisha for having us here. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Markus said, I want to provide a bit of an overview that is motivated really by two very important and contradictory developments. One, of course, is the war in Ukraine and the impact that it's having on the European energy economy. I was recently in Greece, where I'm from, and the price of energy, of course, has gone very high, and all kinds of geopolitics is playing out. And we see that happening with respect to the switch that Germany is attempting with respect to natural gas, which is transforming really the European energy mixture. So that's one motivation, what is happening in Europe, particularly in Europe, but also beyond Europe in response to the war in Ukraine. And the effort of Europeans to achieve some kind of energy security in light of the coming winter. So that's one approach. But at the same time, a very interesting thing is taking place in the United States, where the government recently passed a law that has a very infelicitous, funny title, Inflation Reduction Act. But it is really an energy policy. And it's an energy policy that decisively promotes renewable energy at the same time that it promotes fossil fuels as well as nuclear power. So we have in the industrial world these two contradictory developments that are taking place. On one hand, an effort to make sure that there is energy security by intensifying the use of fossil fuels, and on the other hand, a mixed strategy of promoting both renewable energy and fossil fuels in the United States. And interestingly enough, there is a connection here because the United States has now become the major exporter of natural gas in the world, and it's a major source of natural gas for Germany and Western Europe. So those are very much tied. And of course, I don't have to tell you all that that has implications for the whole world political economy, the whole energy economy, and not just the North. So the question that Markus anticipated, the approach, is one that suggests, how do we deal with that situation? Is it really the strategy to continuously try to deal with the energy crisis by managing and trying to control either energy insecurity, or try to promote renewable energy at the same time that we also promote fossil fuels? And as an exercise, I like to suggest three scenarios to this current strategies for our consideration. And the first one is what we may call managing energy, and which would be to essentially try to cut down on the uses of fossil fuel as much as possible by more efficiency, more conservation, and trying to make sure that we have energy security as is being attempted right now. I think this is the least socially and ecologically ambitious approach. And it's very possible that it will create all kinds of job opportunities by settling retrofitting in more efficient electric vehicles and so on. But I do not think that it will cut down on the uses of energy. There's a lot of evidence that sometimes the more efficient you become in terms of using conventional kinds of energy, or perhaps non-conventional types of energy, the more you use, as a matter of fact. There is very strong evidence of that in the United States and in Europe. So this is one approach, one alternative to the ongoing efforts that, as we see them in Europe and the United States. A second approach would be to just basically try to do away as much as possible with fossil fuel energy and replace it as much as possible again with renewable energy. And of course, that's what presumably the Inflation Reduction Act is doing in the United States, or it hopes to do over the long term. For me, renewable energy is a desirable option, but I don't think it's really sufficient if we don't also deal with how much energy we use and how we use it. And as Patrick mentioned, when we think about renewable energy, we really should be thinking about the fact that renewable energy, like fossil fuel energy, is a major industrial undertaking with supply chains that cover the world, involve all kinds of the imperialist practices, but also all kinds of exploitative practices around the world. And I was looking at the policy of the United States with respect to renewables, in particular in promoting electric vehicles and electric batteries. And of course, the next issue that emerges, where are those minerals going to come from and how? And what are the geopolitical relations between the United States and China? So there's a lot of geopolitics as well involved in competing over primacy in electric batteries, but also in wind and solar power. So renewable energy by itself does not really solve the problem, because if it's not done right, it can have pretty pernicious, pretty bad social and ecological impacts. Certainly in the United States, the renewable energy sector is much less unionized, for instance, than the fossil fuel sector. And quite frequently, its ecological practices, the environmental standards, are really inferior even to, and this might be surprising, to some of the fossil fuel practices. And one would not expect that, but that's certainly the case. So yes, renewable energy is a desirable route, but if we don't change production and consumption, if we don't change the context within which energy is being used, I don't think that we are going to really transform or change our overall political economy and the consumption of energy. Which brings us to the third alternative, one which suggests that in order to really deal with our desire to consume more and more energy and more extraction, in order to deal with that, we need to also change the way we produce and consume. We need to place energy within its broader political economy. We should not just think about energy, the push for the use of energy, but the pull for the need for energy. And that's changing production and consumption. What do we produce and how and why and so on and so forth. That's probably the most ambitious way of thinking about transforming energy and thinking about energy, but and certainly it's aspirational, but at the same time, there are many examples of actually us rethinking what we produce and how we produce it and what we consume, so that we can cut down on energy and move ourselves in the direction of more ecologically and social production activities. So just starting out from some very well-known examples, we can of course change our buildings, we can change our transportation, we can cut on our office work time. Very importantly, one of the evidence suggests that ostentatious production and consumption in the global north and parts of the global south accounts for significant carbon inequities. And a very interesting piece of evidence is that in the last 40 years, the production of emissions by the lowest 50% of people in the global north has declined, which is a pretty amazing finding if you think about it. But as you are going up in the wealth staircase, shall we say, it has increased. So there are many ways that we can think of changing the way we do things and modifying the way we do things to cut down on energy consumption and production by changing the overall political economy, our overall system of production and consumption. But what I want to also suggest is that perhaps we need to think about stopping certain kinds of activities. Quite frequently when we start talking about there are certain kinds of economic activities that need to be stopped, it's kind of shocking, like how can we do that? But it's really quite common in history that at particular points in time, people, societies, the labor movement, the ecological movement, the women's movement, lead in the direction of doing away with certain practices, whether that's slavery or keeping women at home and so on. But in our days, one of the examples that really has stuck with me as I study environmental politics is that when issues emerge, for example, with respect to certain kinds of poisonous substances in toys, right? In toys for children, parents do not say, and parents are mostly workers, right? They are not just parents, they are working parents. They don't say, please just put a little sign there that says that this particular toy includes lead. We just want to do away with it. We want to stop a particular kind of practice. Workers quite frequently say that certain occupational practices should be discontinued. They're not just saying just lessen them, stop, just control them. Let's say stop them. Stop them. So I think it's important as we're trying to deal with our energy consumption and production to place it within the overall production and consumption system, and to ask how we can redirect our energy production and consumption towards more environmentally and socially useful practices. And the point I want to make is that that is not, while we don't have a world like that yet, we have many, many examples of actually discontinuing certain kinds of harmful social and ecologically practices. Unfortunately, we also have many examples of not discontinuing them. And that's exactly the issue at hand. And to go back and to close, to go back to what Patrick said, all of those paths that I mentioned, just managing energy, moving towards renewables, or trying to change the way we produce and consume energy by changing our production and consumption system, by moving towards more socially and ecologically beneficial practices, cannot take place without a massive and systemic just transition. These are very major changes. Even managing energy is a major transition. Without some kind of systemic just transition policy, both nationally, but also within the whole world political economy, where of course the global north has significant reparation obligations, it will not take place. So I want to stop here, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss that a little bit more. Thanks.
Yeah, many thanks to Dimitris. So thanks to both of you for this very interesting and inspiring inputs. Yeah, I think we can see that there is not only a problem with the fossil fuel sector, but also with the renewable energies. If we think that we can simply replace fossil fuels, but not changing something about the overall economic activities. Yeah. So the transition is not simply about questioning or transforming the energy base, but also questioning and transforming the whole political economy. I think this is the main challenge we are confronted with. Yeah. So taking on a perspective of social reproduction, of equality within and between societies. For which purposes do we want to use energy, and which economic, social activities has to be phased out or even forbidden? Yeah. Which role can workers, in a broad sense, play in this process? These are some questions that arise from your contributions and from your inputs, and I would like to open the floor for contributions from the audience. I see already 3 comments or questions, and we will collect them. Please try to be short, because we only have half an hour left, and we will collect some questions, and then I would hand over again to Patrick and Dimitris for responding to the questions. So the first who is going to speak is Shadat Hossein. Please please switch on your camera when you talk, and introduce yourself shortly.
Hello.
Abdur, please.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Here, Patrick Bond and Dimitris Stevis, they are 2 speakers. It's nicely a speech for the energy savings. But one point I got the Dimitris Stevis, the children Troy, the more effective or the less effective for the toxin in this world. So how we can control this kind of toxin or plastic uses for the energy saving?
Could you repeat the last question? How can we? Was it directed at me, right?
Yeah, just Dimitris Stevis sir just mentioned the example for the children toy. Children toy the plastic uses or energy. So now my question is how we control these plastic uses and for the energy savings.
The plastic, did you say plastic?
Yep, I mentioned the plastic uses.
Okay, plastic. Because most plastic, at least at this point, is produced through the use of natural gas and oil. Is that what? Am I getting it right, Abdur? I couldn't hear very well.
I think it was the question how can we control and avoid that poisons are used in plastic. So it's not so closely related to what you have talked about, but it was an example. I think you gave an example that things can be forbidden. Yeah, that's
a very good point. Yeah, that's okay. I'm glad you mentioned that about plastics. We've been talking about it with a group here about how do we move away, for instance, from plastics. Is there a solution to that? Of course, one solution is to say that we are going to move away from plastics, period. I recall when I first went to Bolivia for about 30 years ago, I was impressed because there were big posters as we were going down from the airport into La Paz that said, the era of the disposable Coca-Cola bottle is coming. So the next year that we went to Bolivia, you couldn't anymore go and buy glass bottles and then return them and reuse them because everybody was promoting plastic. So what I experienced, there was a very immediate transition in terms of the use of reusable containers to disposable containers. It was a very purposeful transition. And certainly growing up in Greece, I grew up in a very small village in Greece, I had that experience. The idea of having plastic bottles when I was growing up, we didn't even know what that was. We used either metal or glass, and we use them again. So first of all, so we do have this knowledge that there was a world not that far away, long ago, where in fact plastic was not as prominent and was doing the same kinds of things as we do today. So at this point in time, we could say, well, we could go to those kinds of containers that are reusable and perhaps minimize. So that's one option. Of course, we have to think also about what it takes to produce glass and so on, but certainly they will be reusable. Of course, there is also now a developing industry of creating plastic through biological processes. So it's very possible that in the next 5 or 10 years, we are going to be seeing quote unquote plastics. They will be through biological process. Now, what the implications of that will be in terms of resources, I do not know. But so we have those two options, going back to reusables and at the same time lowering the amount of reusables that we use, or the other is to pursue innovations that do not use natural gas and oil as the source for plastics. So we do have options, not easy politically, no doubt about it. In the United States, Shell Oil just opened a huge plastics factory in Pennsylvania to basically take advantage of the abundance of natural gas. So there is this lock-in that is taking place. But at the same time, I think we have historical examples of alternatives and also innovations for the future. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a very good question. I agree with you. It's a very important one.
Okay, many thanks. And so please raise your hand if you have further questions and comments. And if the oral communication is difficult, then you can also insert your questions in the chat. Yeah. So Elira will have a look at the chat and perhaps tell us some of the questions or inform us about some of the points that have been raised there. Are there further questions or comments from the audience?
I think there is one in the chat, and perhaps Patrick, you may want to respond to that. How can we reconcile the current challenge of energy poverty resulting from war with the challenge of global poverty, in addition to the abandoned diagnosis? Will we have proposals?
If I may, not only take that great challenge, which is the alliance of the proletariat and the poor, and in this country, the most unequal in the world, in the most unequal city here in Johannesburg, we're very aware of I hate to use the term, labor aristocracy, a distance between those who have jobs, who have benefits, who can be insiders in South African capitalism, on the one hand, and the vast majority who are not. We have an unemployment rate of close to 50%. So I think the answer might be in a combination of areas. I put them on the PowerPoint slide, so you can download that, or I've just put a link to an article spelling it out more. A link to an article with Desmond Dessau that we put together after the Glasgow Climate Summit, because we were so disappointed that in 6 areas, very briefly, I think it's not just the sort of linkage of the poor and the working class, but it's really serious commitments to climate justice that range across 6 basic areas. The first being cutting the emissions with binding possibilities of accountability, and distributing them fairly, and making sure we bring in the military, which is, what we're seeing with Ukraine, of course, Western NATO sort of weapons and the destruction that the Russian army is engaged in, massive problems with emissions just right then and there. And secondly, that there are aspects of the just transition that go beyond energy: transport, tourism, agriculture, urbanization, and production systems, consumption and disposal. And I think Dimitris' talk about consumption and the need for energy conservation is absolutely correct. Labor has to be really on top of that, because so much of the surplus value of workers is then just wasted in ridiculous uses of energy. Thirdly, the social injustices of race, indigenous people, the global South, feminists, LGBTQI, and especially the youth have to be put together in a coherent, united front of labor and all the other social forces. The fourth is tricky, which is to manage green technology properly as a global public good and not fall for the scams of net zero and other technical false solutions. The fifth, we really have to work on leaving fossil fuels underground, especially with our oil and chemical workers, right? And seize new exploration and call these unextracted assets what they are. They're stranded. And then finally, get the finance right. And that includes, may I put this to all of you, it includes a climate debt. I'm in the global north here in Johannesburg, right? In an academic bohemian suburb called Melville. Some of you might have visited Melville. And I think certainly my own carbon footprint, but more generally, this class of the petty bourgeoisie that I'm in, academics amongst us here, you know who you are, we actually should be doing much more to call our class and the rich, especially the top 10% in the world, which includes some organized labor who have good lifestyles in the West. We have to call out the need for climate debt and reparations, right? And it's so important these days with Queen Elizabeth II's passing. The idea of reparations for what Britain has done through slavery and colonialism and neocolonialism, neoliberalism, and London is a hot money center. All of these are under discussion in a way that perhaps they weren't before last week. And I think reparations on climate and abuse of environment and unequal ecological exchange, it's a ripe topic. I'd love labor to be out there at the vanguard of calling for that sort of justice as well. That would link us, the proletariat, and the poor, and those in the petty bourgeoisie, like those in the House, who have a conscience. What do you think, comrades?
Thanks. Further questions and comments, either in the chat or orally? Patrick, so there is one question, Patrick. How will we control the tourism energy.
Well, that's a great question.
Could you please?
Yeah, what do we all think about this? Because I certainly was in Italy last week at an academic conference. It was a bit of academic tourism. I needed that after COVID to be in direct contact with my comrades in the International Initiative for Progressive Political Economy. So I flew about 12 tons worth of my CO2, my carbon footprint, my at least 3 or 4 years worth of my fair emissions just in that one trip last week. So what do we do? So one question that I hope we can get the labor movement to grapple with is the extent to which very dirty forms of tourism, which are international air travel, long-haul flights, like some of you comrades visiting us all the way down at the bottom of Africa. Well, we should be actually thinking that through, because carbon taxes will start to apply to air traffic. And unfortunately, we're going to be in a situation of travel apartheid or tourism apartheid. Okay, we already have that. We have rich people going off. One guy from this city called Elon Musk has his tourism up into outer space, right? And so we have a lot of crazy uses of airline fuels. There was a hope that Richard Branson could get some sort of biomass-based airline fuel. There may be some technical fix at some point, but I would love us to have that sort of discussion about what is responsible tourism. And indeed, there are so many aspects of our life if we pull it apart. This is not, by the way, to personalize this. It's not basically to say, we who are relatively more privileged to travel around, we should be rethinking. I think there is an argument there, and we have to figure out. I always ask myself, how do I pay my climate debt? Which activists do I make a contribution to move the struggle forward as my way of doing it? Not a carbon offset, but a movement building offset. And those are the sorts of things I hope we can all grapple with. The reason is that we will be called out as being hypocrites. We will be called out if we're making broad arguments for transitions. We know we're tracked into systems, but there are many areas of luxury consumption. In the global north in Johannesburg, as much to blame as anyone. And I really like the way Dimitris put it. He went through a whole series of areas of conservation, and just seeing Italy turn off the Eiffel Tower and Germany having to go cold turkey, as they say, on Russian gas imports. Maybe Markus, Lira, and others in those situations, maybe you're beginning to get ideas about where these kinds of economies or punishments or ways in which we take energy as a commons, a collectively decided eco-socialist planning challenge into the next period, because we're going to need it, since we know the likes of Olaf Scholz, his answer is to fly to South Africa and demand we supply him with more coal. And I don't think too many of us in the House are happy with that arrangement.
Yeah, many thanks. Yeah, so the planning issue, I think, is quite important, and it is going to be on the political agenda in the
Markus,
next month. Yeah, so,
you've been asking this question about the imperial mode of consumption. Would you not have a way to link this critique you've done of overconsumption to labor, in which we have a globally differentiated labor movement? It's a terribly important connection. I use, by the way, something called Story of Stuff as my grounding, because there are a lot of nice quick films that I hope will become something to link the exploitation of work, the exploitation of social reproduction, of especially women's unpaid work, and the exploitation of nature. And I think Markus is not far from where Rosa Luxemburg herself was very active in thinking about this in her way of thinking about capitalism and the non-capitalist super exploitative relationship. Maybe, Markus, what is the imperial mode of consumption, in case people haven't heard of it yet?
I think just a short answer on that, but I have elaborated a bit more on that and my contribution to the Just and Green course. So I invite you to have a look at that. Yeah, it is the idea that it's not just consumption; it's also production. We call it imperial mode of living. Yeah, that is a mode of living that is based on a disproportionate access and use of resources, things, that is ecosystems that absorb certain emissions, like, for example, rainforests in the case of CO2, and labor power on a global scale. Yeah, and this is something that divides the working class, one can say, because, of course, workers in the global north are very strongly involved into this imperial mode of living by, for example, driving cars, being embedded in fossil fuel-based electricity and energy infrastructures. You know, it's not their will, it's not their intention to do that, but they simply cannot evade it because of the infrastructures, the institutions, of the imaginaries, of the way their societies function. Yeah. I think this is a very important point. Yeah, we have to discuss that because it would be an illusion to think that workers and all over the world can unite and have common interests. No, there's also a divide between a competition between workers, a divide among the working class on a global scale. We have to take this into account and discuss the consequences for progressive political strategies that emerge from this. Yeah. So that maybe as a very short answer on what you have raised as a comment or question, Patrick. So now I see that Lokman Hossein would like to comment or raise a question. And then I would have also a further question to both of you, Patrick and Dimitris. And I think then we should even come to an end. We have about 10 minutes left. Yeah. So let's listen to the question and comment by Lokman Hossein, and then to my question, and then it's up to Patrick and Dimitris for a final comment.
Yes, good evening. This is Lokman speaking. Exactly what's happening to know that Bangladesh is a very beautiful country. Bangladesh is a very beautiful country, and it is the to know that Bangladesh Cox's Bazar is a 122 kilometer beach area, and one mangrove in the Bangladesh. One mangrove in the Bangladesh is the Sundarban. Bangladesh tea plantation and water plantation and rice plantation, everything in the Bangladesh. But it's some problem. We got some problem. The problem is the sound pollution. How can we control the sound pollution? Thank you so much.
Markus, just before you go to your question, we did have a great suggestion from Gifford in the chat about the question of tourism. Tourists must work on ecological remediation in whatever bioregion they visit. So something to put on the list. And I think there is a question from both Alejandra and Bashman about many unions in the global south are yet to see climate crisis as a priority. How do we bring them in? So perhaps in the final remarks that both Patrick and Dimitris to your question.
If I may,
okay, Dimitris, please just wait and let me raise my short question, and then I think you would, and then we would have the final statements by you. So I think my question would be also regarding union strategies. Yeah. So where do you see entry points for unions to progressively work on the labor environment relationship and to overcome the jobs versus environment dilemma? Yeah. Patrick mentioned that NUMSA used to be an eco-socialist trade union. It used to have eco-socialist position, and it made a U-turn. That is how you started your presentation. Yeah. So are there some eco-socialist legacies within the union? Is there a discussion? Is this U-turn contested? Are there other unions contesting what is done and what is practiced by NUMSA currently? Yeah? And Dimitris, regarding the United States, you have also worked on the on issues of just transition in the co-regions and of the United States. And where do you see an entry points for progressive union strategies in your country, but also internationally? That would be my question to you. And now I would ask you to give your final comments and statements, also on the question of the others.
Do you want me to go first, or okay. I was going to connect it to the discussion on tourism, which is very important. And this whole idea of the so-called service sector, which we often think that unions in the service sector in health, education, tourism, leisure, and so on, do not really have a voice, should not have a voice with respect to energy use and production, because that's the domain of energy producing and consuming unions. And I think that's really a very tricky path to take, because it silences a significant number of unions and workers who use not only energy, but all kinds of other materials. So I think that in order for us to think about the energy situation in the United States more broadly is to think about energy more broadly. Who produces and uses energy more broadly? And in this particular case, in the United States, some of the quote-unquote service unions are also the ones that have the more progressive, not necessarily eco-socialist perspectives on energy, but much more progressive, much more inclusive, much more ecological. However, those that we conventionally would call energy unions have created this narrative that it is only them that can talk about energy and about production and consumption. I think that's really a problematic situation. To give you an example, the healthcare industry accounts for 10% of the global emissions, not to mention all kinds of other things. It's a major infrastructure undertaking. Same thing with education, same thing with tourism that we talked about, same thing of all the kinds of services. So those unions and those workers ought to participate in those discussions, particularly since changes in energy production and consumption are also affecting them. As teachers, as healthcare providers, not to mention, of course, all kinds of other situations. So I think that the debate, the discussion within the working class, within unions about energy has to be broadened and be taken away to some degree from a monopoly by just unions that focus on energy production and use. This may be a demanding question, a demanding issue, but I think certainly is necessary.
Patrick, please.
Yes, may I go ahead? I think there are two quick points to make before 4:30. The first is regarding NUMSA. It's a very specific question. And Markus is worried, as we all must be, that one of the great unions that had been genuinely addressing these questions of a just transition has then become a very defensive institution. And I think it's partly because we've done such a very weak job, especially in our climate justice circuits, and I work a lot with all sorts of unions, but the failure to bring unions and our communities, environmentalists, the youth, women, and community, rural folks, fisher folks, all of the forces we could have been bringing together, and we failed to do that. I think that U-turn then partly is explained by how weak the rest of our climate movement has been. However, there's also a big movement shift because, let me say, a sort of force within that trade union leadership has become more conservative in all sorts of ways. And I'll just link here to an article explaining NUMSA, this union of 300,000, and why it's changed. Now, my second point, the very final point, because I loved all these micro connectivities that we're thinking about, all the ways in which in our daily lives, but also building unions to become strong forces in society. The one that I don't think we've talked about is macroeconomics as a link to energy and to climate. And one reason that's going to be so vital, and I can think of the labor movements of Egypt and Tunisia about 12 years ago as they were getting going in late 2010. And then the Arab Spring happens, the North African uprisings, and suddenly our labor movements have been absolutely central in an overthrow of illegitimate dictatorial regimes. I can also think back many years, 35, 40 years, to the IMF riots, to the third world protests around the debt and the fact that as northern banks, the World Bank and IMF squeezed poor countries, austerity hit. And labor was often at the front line. I think of Brazil and Lula, Ignacio da Silva, the metal worker who led movements of Brazilian workers to contest IMF. And there is such a movement today around the world, starting from Argentina, actually, called debtforclimate.org. And you'll find attempts to say exactly at this level of sort of macroeconomics, where foreign debt for emerging markets, emerging economies, poor economies is becoming excruciating. It's excellent to see Sri Lankans, as a result, invade the presidential palace. It's excellent that Pakistanis are out protesting and hoping for a more democratic government after that quasi-coup. It's excellent that Zambians are on the streets. These are three of the countries that are massively in debt. But there's also ways to connect the climate crisis, especially in a place like Pakistan, where so many of us in the global north owe so much climate reparations for the tragedies of a third of their country underwater the last few days. So I think those are ways that organized labor's great strength in thinking as a class and for the class, and not trying to be a substitutionist in areas of let's say, weakness like climate advocacy, but really finding ways to connect the dots between a sort of macroeconomic sense of economic justice and the climate justice that we all need to pursue. So maybe that's one of the international linkages with very strong Argentine roots, a little bit here in South Africa called Debt for Climate. And maybe there are others of you, that have ways to connect the dots. I'll put my email in the chat box, and I hope you can stay in touch with me, because I think that's the critical context, right? It's challenging the crisis of global capitalism as it hits each of our national states, so that when we reply, we're not simply trying to overthrow a presidency, we're trying to do something much bigger for the future of all our people and their future generations. Thanks, comrades.
Yeah, many thanks. So I heard out, let's say, at least 3 linkages that should be constructed, that should be strengthened, or which we should work on. The first one being a linkage among unions, that, for example, service unions or unions that are more closely connected to certain everyday practice of people often are more progressive, and that the traditional white male labor unions can learn from them and can indeed benefit from working closer together with them. The second linkage would be a linkage between unions on the one side and the climate justice movement on the other side. That has to be strengthened. There are a lot of examples, and in our discussion, we learn about some of these examples. In Germany, there has been a very interesting cooperation between the service union on the one hand and Fridays for Future on the other hand, in cooperating regarding negotiations of a collective agreement for transport workers. A very promising example. Yeah. And the third linkage, that would be the one between northern and southern progressive movements that could indeed be shaped around the issue of debt and reparations for damages that have been done by the global north to the global south. That would be 3 linkages that I have heard out of your final statements and out of the discussion. And I think these are worthwhile to further think about and to further elaborate and strengthen them. Yeah, let me say thank you again to Patrick and Dimitris for your excellent contributions and for being with us and discussing with us. Thanks also to Elira. Would you, Elira, say something, a final word, please?
Yes, so really, thank you so much for such an interesting discussion. We know that the time is never enough, but we are continuing this one. Please enroll in our course, Just and Green Labor's Ecological Question. Next week, we have a range of workshops taking place around the same time. So to be able to have our comrades both from Asia and the Americas to join. And on the 7th of October, we're organizing a webinar with the engineers and workers from the Lucas plant, from the famous Lucas plant. So we want to have a conversation about what did they do to transform production. And we really hope to see you there and to join us throughout the course in the platform, online, offline. You have the emails of our experts. So please be as active as possible. We have a big struggle ahead, and we need all the power and energy of everybody to be engaged. So thanks a lot, and take care, everyone, and stay safe.